So now I want to talk to you about variables. They're super important, and from this point on, we're going to be seeing a lot of variables. Now I want you to think about your computer and your computer's memory. It's made up of all kinds of little storage areas or parking lots almost for the values that you have in your code. So for instance, say you wanted to add up all the sales you have for the first quarter. You might have a variable called January total, one called Feb totals, maybe one called March totals. Well, VBA knows what a lot of words mean. It knows what sub means, it knows what active cell means, it knows what Windows means, but it doesn't know what March totals mean. So you have to tell VBA what March total means by telling it, hey, I'm going to store data in something that I'm calling March totals, and that data is going to be a currency or a number or whatever it is. So when you think about computing and when you think about VBA, I want you to think of that value that you're asking the computer to store as a variable. So you say, hey VBA, I want to sum up my first quarter totals. And among other things, I'm going to have a variable called March totals. And I want that to be a currency. Well, letting VBA know all this is called declaring a variable. And I'll show you how that's done in a minute. But when you declare a variable, you start with the keyword of dim, D-I-M. Now, dim is an oldie-timey abbreviation. It stands for dimension. But I like to tell students, because sometimes it's easier to think of acronyms, I like to tell students that they could think of it as declare in memory, D-I-M, declare in memory. It doesn't stand for declare in memory, but a lot of times that helps people remember, okay, I want to create a variable. What do I do first? I need to declare it in memory. I need to type in dim. And again, we're going to see that in 1 second. All right, so after you type in dim, your variable has to have a name. So there are some rules that you need to follow when you are naming your variables. First, your variable has to either start with a letter or an underscore. But after that, you can use letters, underscores, and numbers, and it can be in any order at all. The thing is that it cannot contain any special characters like the pound sign or dollar signs or exclamation points. And don't put any spaces in there. No spaces and no periods. And you can have up to 255 characters, but you really want to keep it shorter than that. I wouldn't go any longer than 80. I personally probably wouldn't go any longer than 10 or 12 characters. And you also want to make sure that it's pretty descriptive as well. All right, and then lastly, it has to be unique. It has to be unique in the area that it's used. So for instance, if you think of like a class, a computer class, if there are 3 people named Brian in the class, and I've had this happen before, a class with 3 Brians in it, and I'm up in front of the class and I say, hey Brian, well, just by those words, you wouldn't know who I was talking to. You wouldn't know which Brian I meant to call on. Same thing here with variables. You can't have 2 variables with the same name. The computer won't know what to do. All right, now there are also some words that you can't and that you really shouldn't use with your variables, and those words are what are called reserved, and they're reserved only for VBA's internal use. Like sub, you can't have a variable called sub. You can't have a variable called active cell, row, column, worksheet, whatever it is. If you try to use one of those words, you're going to get an error. All right, so let me show you how this works. So here I am back in Excel, back in my VBE, and I've just created a quick sub-procedure called variable example. And I'm going to go ahead and start declaring a variable. As I mentioned before, you need to start with the keyword there of dim, and then you need to type in a name. I'll call this one March totals. So again, I'm using 2 words there, but I have no space, and I capitalize both words, just like I did when I named the sub-procedure. Now if I hit enter on my keyboard, I want you to notice that dim there is recognized now as a keyword because it's highlighted there in blue, or the text color changed to blue. And I'm going to be talking to you about what's called scope a little bit later on. But since I declared my variable here within the sub-procedure, then this variable can only be used right now within this sub-procedure. All right, so I mentioned that my March totals were currency, and currency is a data type. And a little bit later on, I'll be talking to you about different data types. But just to show you real quick right now, if I wanted to declare this as a data type, then I would type in the keyword there of as, and I get my little IntelliSense menu that pops down. And I'll go ahead and start typing in currency. Once I see it highlighted there in blue, I can go ahead and hit the Tab key on my keyboard. So again, I'll get into data types soon, but I've just declared March totals there as a currency. Now, something else that I like to do, I like to tell Visual Basic that a variable can't be used options. And in my editor, actually the only thing here that's not checked by default is require variable declaration. So I'm going to go ahead and check that and click on OK. Now this is from this point on forward. So if I open up or if I create a new module, I now have these keywords here. I have option explicit. So now I have to declare my variables. Now, if you don't see option explicit at the top of your screen, but you want to ensure that your variables get declared, and I'll head on back to sheet 1. Remember, this code module was created before I turned on option explicit. So all I have to do here is actually type it out up at the top of the screen, the very top, and then hit enter on my keyboard. It highlights there in blue in the general declaration area, so I know I'm good to go. So I'm going to recommend to you, before you go any further creating your VBA, that you go up to Tools and Options and that you require your variables to be declared. And if you're working with prior code and you don't see option explicit at the top, all you have to do is just go ahead and type it in.